Welcome to Web3 Watchdogs, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of Web3 security, compliance, and risk. Join Michael Pearl as he interviews executives from across the Web3 industry to uncover the challenges and opportunities of this rapidly evolving space. Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by Cyvers, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. Cyvers harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit cyvers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Web3 Watchdogs, the podcast that focuses on everything security, fraud, scam, compliance, and basically anything that has to do with safety and security in the Web3 space. And today we have Nick Wright. Nick is the Chief Legal Officer at VALR Group. Nick, how are you?
All good, Michael. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So tell us about yourself, about your background. How did you come to work as the Chief Legal Officer at VALR?
Yeah, VALR, the easiest way to say it.
It's VALR. Got it.
So I've quite an interesting background. Once upon a time, I was a marine biologist, and
Wow.
I decided that I wanted to do environmental law, and then ended up not enjoying environmental law, so got into commercial law, and around that time, Bitcoin was still in its infancy, and I had a friend who was doing actually a thesis on Bitcoin, and I think the thesis was entitled "Magic Internet Money" at the University of Cape Town. Yeah, since then my interest peaked. That was still in its early days. And I started trading in crypto and getting used to what blockchain is and what Bitcoin is and all those good things. And I ended up at a law firm where I practiced commercial law, corporate law, and I ended up at KPMG as an advisor, joined their blockchain team, assisted with looking at risks and regulations and compliance from both a corporate and a financial law perspective, as well as helping the South African team with crypto type laws. And then one of my good friends had joined VALR, which was, South Africa didn't have many crypto exchanges at the time. And VALR was starting out and wanted to be one of the leading players in the game. And I jumped at the opportunity because I was, what a space to be in. Always changing, things are always changing, things are always moving. And it's never a dull day in the crypto sector.
For sure.
So joined as legal counsel at VALR, and very blessed to have the opportunity to be the chief legal officer.
Yeah. First of all, as a former lawyer myself, I can tell you that not being interested in your practice is a very common thing.
Yeah.
So I can totally relate. For a lawyer being in this space, it's fascinating. Everything is moving so fast. It's obviously very challenging as well, but I guess it comes with the territory.
Yeah, exactly. No regulation is the same day to day.
For sure. We're going to talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about VALR? It's South Africa's largest crypto exchange, right?
Yeah, so we are South Africa's largest crypto exchange by trade volume. Our tagline is effectively the largest crypto exchange headquartered in Africa by trade volume. We started.
By the way, sorry to interrupt you, but is South Africa, in terms of crypto trading, is it larger than other African countries like Nigeria, for instance? Because I know that crypto is huge there.
Yeah, so from an exchange perspective, South Africa hosts the largest exchanges from a license perspective. However, the trade in other areas in Africa, like in Nigeria, is volumes greater than South Africa, on the basis that most of that trade is done peer-to-peer. So an exchange like a Binance will operate in Nigeria, or used to operate in Nigeria before.
We all know the story.
Before Tigran's story, and offers peer-to-peer trading in that environment. And a lot of exchanges work in places like Nigeria and Kenya on the basis of a peer-to-peer exchange model. We don't, at VALR, we don't offer that. We're more your central order book platform.
Got it. And how many users do you have right now?
Yeah, so currently we turned 7 a month ago and have 1.2 million users. So with 1.2 million users, we're doing about $30 million of trade a day on the order book, a little bit more on your OTC side of things and your OTC desk. We also recently launched our futures platform, which is an exciting development in South Africa. And yeah, hoping, so we raised our Series B fundraising round in 2022, so a few years back. And with that, aiming to expand globally and expand our reach into various regions, Africa, Europe, looking at places where we as VALR can potentially win. It's very difficult to go against a lot of the big exchanges that have a lot of capital. But we've got a very good team, a team that punches above its weight, as I'd say.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about your expansion to other countries in a second. But before we dive into that, just a quick question, because I guess most of the viewers and the listeners are not really familiar with the regulatory framework, the compliance framework in South Africa. How hard is it to obtain a license for an exchange? What type of a license is it? Maybe a few words about the local regulator and the relationship with it.
Yeah, great. Good question. So South Africa, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, the regulators called the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, the FSCA, they declared cryptocurrency or crypto assets, as they call it, as a financial product, essentially bringing it in line with the current financial regulations, which can be difficult to do because you're fitting a very niche new type of asset into a different regime. And yeah, so that was essentially the start of it from a financial services perspective. The FSCA in South Africa takes a lot of its laws or looks to for inspiration for a lot of its laws from the UK FCA, as well as the European regulators. So you'll find that a lot of South Africa's financial laws in particular are very similar to what you'd find in the UK, as an example. From an AML perspective, we have a financial AML regulator that goes by the name of the Financial Intelligence Center, or FIC, as we call it. And FIC named all crypto asset service providers as what they call authorized accountable institutions. And as an accountable institution, you basically have to follow all of your AML practices, suspicious transaction reports, suspicious activity reports, all those good things. And South Africa's regime in general follows very closely the FATF regime. So again, for those of you who don't know South Africa or anything like that, we do follow very much a FATF AML style regime, and same reporting. We use Go AML, same as many countries around the world. I'm sure you'll get into it a bit later, but it leads to a relatively easy passporting of our AML into other jurisdictions.
Yeah, maybe you can say a few words about the term passporting, because maybe some listeners are not familiar with that.
Yeah. I mean passporting not in the sense of a Mika type passporting, but in the sense of the laws, particularly AML laws that follow FATF, all follow very similar type of reporting standards, guidelines, what your MLRO needs to be doing. So when I'm talking about passporting, I'm maybe not the best way of saying it, but it's being able to take your process and procedures that you're currently doing now and using them in a different jurisdiction, like in Dubai. Adapting them to the local laws, but the general laws at a group level are going to be very similar, or the general processes at a group level are going to be very similar.
Got it. So you mentioned the AML rules, and obviously the FATF it focuses on anti-terror funding, which is hence the acronym.
Yeah.
But what about, let's say, funds that originate from scams, from hacks, or just plain money laundering of other real world assets?
Yeah. So South Africa also takes a page out of European books. So we have our AML laws are very similar to the laws of Europe and very similar to the laws of VALR in Dubai, as an example. So all of your AML reporting is done by GoAML. All of your suspicious transactions, suspicious activity. We at VALR have a number of tools in place, such as your transaction monitoring tools, your blockchain monitoring tools, to make sure that anything coming from addresses linked to fraud or linked to any AML risks, that those are highlighted. And we follow, in general, a risk-based approach in South Africa, which is very similar to around the world. And obviously, given that we kind of follow this global legal process, we also take into account all the sanctions across the world. So we follow very much an OFAC, UN, EU sanctions regime. So looking at sanctioned entities across the world and making sure that those funds don't breach VALR.
Got it. And you've mentioned the fact that you have to practice, basic transaction monitoring and suspicious transaction analysis and so on. Do you have any clear guidance into how you do that? So that is something that I hear across the board from, chief legal officers, chief compliance officers, that, you're expected to basically do this monitoring, but nobody explains how. So for instance, how many hops do you have to go until you say, okay, I'm stopping here and the funds are legit? Or if you see any suspicion, how deep do you have to dig to figure out whether these funds are suspicious and so on?
Yeah, it's a great question. Our regulators are very principles based and not definitive in what they don't say go and do X, right? They say you need to be worried about X, Y, and Z risk. So AML risk as an example. So how you approach that in South Africa is a risk-based approach. And if you identify certain behaviors over time that indicate those risks that you're talking about, then you need to be able to put into place things that are stopping that. VALR is one of those institutions that takes probably a more proactive approach than the rest. So we do look at numerous hops before, if we identify that, there's something fishy happening a few hops down the line, we are definitely going to be flagging it on our side. The same in terms of a sanctioned wallet. If there's indirect exposure to a sanctioned wallet, it has dramatic consequences for us as well. So we take a more cautious approach to that side of things, where it's not just a direct exposure to a fraudulent hop, but 3 or 4, 5, 6 hops down the line. It all depends on the transaction monitoring tool you're using as well, how clear the hops are, how clear the behavior is, all feeds into your risk-based approach engine and spits out that answer that you look at on your computer and then decide. Yeah. So a pretty legal answer, it depends.
Yeah. That's always a good answer.
Yeah.
And what kind of tools are you using to monitor, if you could share?
Yeah, sure. So from a transaction monitoring and chain monitoring perspective, we use Chainalysis. That's, call it our go-to tool. From that perspective, from a KYC sanctions onboarding, we are using a few tools. So we're using a KYC tool called Veriff, VERIFF, based in Estonia, and also Onfido, ONFIDO. I think they rebranded to Entrust yesterday. And then a third tool that we're using now for travel rule purposes is SumSub. And then internally, we've also built our own fraud risk engine, which is our own proprietary tool. And that tool feeds on behavioral triggers that we're picking up from other chains and other chain investigation software, and builds, call it tags or alerts based on behavior that we are seeing, not just on chain, but through fiat systems and behaviors on the exchange itself. As an example, if you were 85 years old and you deposited 50,000 Rand on the exchange, it would immediately flag on VALR. There's a strange behavior, and then that gets escalated to our fraud risk engine. Are you being assisted, sir? Are you being promised returns that you shouldn't be promised? VALR doesn't have any agents, etc. So we have all these triggers based on your behavior on the exchange and on chain, as well as in the fiat system.
That's super interesting. I would love to go back to that in a second, because I would love to zoom in on that. I know that some exchanges are doing that, creating some sort of internal fraud prevention tools. And I would love to expand on that, but I really want to ask one question with respect to AML first.
Yeah.
How do you view, not you specifically at VALR, but in general in South Africa, how do you view mixers? Because, mixers, just a quick historical overview, they weren't that big of a thing a few years ago when they started off, right? It was kind of a semi-libertarian tool for, privacy and so on. And then obviously everything exploded, and we all know what happened to the founder of Tornado Cash. And now, actually, a very interesting piece of news that I've read recently, that the Trump team, the Trump administration, is looking into decriminalizing mixers, right?
Yeah.
And that changes everything with respect to what we've known, because until now, mixers were almost equivalent to illicit funds, right?
Yeah.
It was suspicious to the level of, guilty by design, right? So how does South Africa views, the use of mixers and funds that originate from mixers?
Yeah, great question. And I'm going to give you a very legal answer. Probably not one that you were looking for, but it really depends on your risk-based approach. It's if you're an exchange, you can take a few approaches, whether you are happy with those funds coming in. Are you comfortable that you're doing enough KYC or enough identification of who the beneficiary of those funds are, where the flow or the source of funds were coming from? If you're able to be comfortable with that, then that's all okay. Generally, as you've said in the past, mixers have been viewed as almost immediately illicit, right?
Yeah.
VALR's view, and I can't dive into too much detail, but VALR's view is that it is high risk because it is used to anonymize your transactions, or similar to if funds go into Monero and then something like that. So we do view it as high risk, although we are more open to looking at it from a risk-based approach, is what I can tell you.
Got it. So it depends. No, I'm kidding.
Depends, exactly.
Okay, so going back to fraud. Okay, so first of all, it's really interesting what you mentioned with respect to that mechanism. But let's zoom out for a second. Usually if you draw kind of the global map of the world, you see that, you can more or less classify countries with respect to scams and fraud by recipients and senders, right? And usually you see, the usual suspects, quote unquote, of recipients, right? We all know that Myanmar, for instance, and other countries in Southeast Asia are usually the recipients. We all heard about, the scam farms primarily practicing what we call pig butchering, right?
Yeah.
And I know that there are some African countries where you can find those farms, some, Eastern European countries where you can find it. And then when you look at the victim side, it's primarily the US, Europe, India, quite surprising to some extent.
Okay.
I'm quoting our recent report that we just released, and I was really surprised during the preparation of this report to see, the different geographies. Now, where does South Africa stand with that respect? Is it let's say, prime location for victimizers with respect to scams and pig butchering more specifically?
Yeah, great question. I would love to see your report, because I'd love to see where if South Africa features on either the victims or the recipient side of things. But
I will share it with you, and I will also add this to the show notes so that our listeners can take a look at that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be very interested to see. From VALR's side, we don't often get the scammer side on VALR. What we will see is that people are victims in South Africa, and generally that goes out to other countries in Africa in general. So you'll find that, and again, I mentioned it before, particularly if if you somebody who's in a vulnerable state, then those people are generally more vulnerable to become victims of pig butchering scams. It can be dependent on a number of factors: age, sitting on lots of money, for example, that sort of thing, and
loneliness, the biggest factor.
Loneliness. And what we do see on VALR is people getting scammed using those pig butchering scams. So maybe we don't see the fraudsters happening in South Africa, but maybe that's just because law enforcement isn't reaching out to us just yet or have identified that funds are coming to VALR for that. We are probably not the best avenue for scammers because we do have all these engines in place and follow full KYC. So I'm hoping that's the case.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine that this would be your answer. So let's look at it from a victim side. That's interesting. So how do you guys spot scams that are, or let's say fraud, a better term, that is being conducted on one of your clients? Can you give me like one theoretical use case? How do you spot it? What's the mechanism for doing that?
Yeah, I'll give you a good, clear example of what exchanges around the world would see, and it's not just VALR, but you would generally see a new user. That user gets fully KYC. In general, this user is what we term either a mule or they're being used by the scammer to KYC themselves. They get KYC themselves. They, on the other side, are being promised ridiculous returns, or they're promised plane tickets, or whatever the scam might be. In this case, VALR's fraud engine, we like to believe, is relatively sophisticated. So there's certain behaviors that trigger us to become alerted to that. So as I said, it will generally be a relatively new user. It will be there's certain age limits, as an example. There's certain actions where it's I can't go into too much detail for not wanting to tip off any scammers, but there are certain transaction behaviors that you can see very clearly that are more than likely to be suspicious. And when you have that suspicion, our fraud engine then kicks in, spots that, flags it to the fraud team. The fraud team will hold on all deposits, potentially freeze the account, potentially block the account before funds get used to be sent, crypto to get sent outwards, out of the country, etc. So yeah, I'd like to think our fraud engine is quite sophisticated, but scammers are always coming up, or fraudsters are always coming up with ways to defeat. They are never ending, right? They're always working out a way to try and defeat the system that they're operating in.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's kind of seeing, for the most of it, you talked about the transaction behavior as well, but for the most of it, it's interesting to see the off-chain side of things, because when we work with our clients, we mostly see the on-chain side of things, and then it's always interesting to see the other side, right? Because what we see usually, we examine the transactions and primarily the target wallets, right? And we flag the wallet as a fraud wallet. And then when you do the reverse engineering, and that's when we get the feedback from our clients, it's super interesting to see how it looks like from the other side, from the victim side of things. What we do is then we trace it to the victimizer side of things. And it's always interesting to see the entire picture. Can you share some details about, okay, so let's say you caught something that you are suspecting as a pig butchering scam. What's the playbook? Do you then go to the client and to the user, to the trader, and ask him, or do you block it? Do you have like a blacklist or something of that sort?
Yeah, another good question. So the first step is obviously we have a few regulatory obligations. So in South Africa, that's your suspicious transaction reporting or suspicious activity reporting, which we immediately need to report to our AML regulator, FEEC. And so that takes place. The second way forward is then to contact the customer. In the event of a pig butchering scam, let's say, then we have a determined list of questions to ask the customer, to say, are you being promised X, Y, and Z? Are you being somebody helping you? Somebody told you to open this VALR account. By the way, step before this, we've obviously frozen a deposit or frozen the account, so that we need to be clear that you aren't being scammed. Rather err on the side of caution, save your pension or save your funds, rather than letting it go.
Let me guess. The majority of the clients would say, no, it's fine.
Absolutely.
It's my girlfriend, it's a good friend of mine, it's my uncle, and so on.
Exactly. So the majority of answers, and it's so frustrating, Mike, you'll see like people are very clearly being scammed and they'll answer no. And so we go a step further generally at VALR, because those set of questions are obviously via our help desk or our support desk. And the concern immediately then turns to, is the scammer potentially operating the account? Or do they have access to your phone? Or are they potentially, do they have access to answering those questions? So the next step is then to phone the client and ask them for a video call, or secondly, to ask them to send through a video answering all of those questions. And then they'll again say no, 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 no. And then it becomes a risk-based decision. Are the factors clear enough to block the account? Are the factors clear enough to just say, we're not allowing it? Is it maybe a chance that they are saying the right thing, speaking the truth? It becomes a risk decision. Ideally, if they are being scammed, what you want to do is then allow them to withdraw the funds from the platform and then just say, look, but back into their own bank account, so not to a crypto scam. So that's kind of a very generalized playbook. There's obviously very niche elements I can't touch on, but yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine it's sensitive. And at the end of the day, you cannot save the user from itself, right?
Yeah.
It's their money, and if they want to make their mistakes, obviously you need to inform them with everything that you have, and to try to warn them.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you one more question, and we're now, I guess, like 2 months after the Bybit hack.
Yeah.
And how do you protect the assets that are custodied by VALR, in a sense that what kind of repercussions do you take in terms of your security measures? Because what we've seen, and we informed Wazirex and Bybit after detecting it first, and seeing this hack, and it was mind-boggling to see those figures on the screen.
Yeah.
And what's surprising or not surprising is that both exchanges and a bunch of other exchanges like Radiant Capital and so on, they had pretty decent, you would think, decent security architectures. And at the end of the day, they got hacked. And obviously we can talk about solutions and how to prevent that, but I'm just curious, what was the atmosphere after the Bybit hack? Have you changed anything? Obviously I will not ask you about your architecture, I understand it's sensitive, but just curious to hear, what was your approach post Bybit?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've now been in the game long enough to see FTX happen, and then now Bybit and all of those things. So the immediate first reaction was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this is happening again, right? And there's this kind of an air of disbelief that this is Bybit, this is huge. Making sure that VALR itself didn't have any there were no implications of VALR because of the hack, or nothing that would affect VALR from it. So that was the immediate first step, making sure that we don't have any funds on Bybit, making sure that our customers aren't sending to Bybit, etc. All of those things. So that was the immediate first step, to make sure that the contagion was cut off. And then it was a case of examining what happened in the hack and how it happened, and re-looking at anything that Bybit were doing that potentially VALR was following and adjusting that slightly. So I would say in general, as you said, most exchanges have pretty good security and signing procedures and processes,
or at least they think they have.
At least they think they have. True. And it was a case of going over those procedures and policies again, just making sure that we as VALR are comfortable, and that we can go with a very clear conscience to our customers and say, we are comfortable, no need to worry from a VALR side. So I must be honest, minimal changes from our side. It was more like almost like an audit that we did, making sure that we are, our signatories are all, multi-sig, geographically dispersed, etc. All of those things that you'd hear around the table.
Got it. So we're approaching the end of the call, even though it was a lot of fun. I wanted to ask you, going back to the beginning, right? Because we focused on South Africa and we went to fraud and scams and so on. But I know that you guys are expanding to other places, right? If I'm not mistaken, to Poland, right? Is that the next location? So please share about the expansion plans, and perhaps also a few words about, how does it feel to move from one regulatory environment to a totally different one?
Yeah, I mean, we've had so many learnings in this expansion journey. Maybe have an episode 2 Yeah, so currently where we are looking is to expand into Europe. We have 2 avenues at the moment, currently Poland, as well as we're going to start the Malta licensing process quite soon. We have preliminary approval from VALR in Dubai, our license there. We also have just kicked off the licensing process in the Cayman Islands, and we have an entity that is now registered with the FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit in India, waiting.
Let me guess, Cayman Islands for the futures?
Correct. South Africa is a very interesting jurisdiction in the sense that we're one of the few jurisdictions in the world that's left with capital controls. And what I mean by that is very difficult to get your South African rand out of the country and into the country. You have to apply to the Reserve Bank basically to have that happen. And we as a South African exchange, that is not an exciting proposition for an international user. So rather have our international users based externally without those capital controls where they can freely bring in their USD and send out the USD or whatever fiat currency they're dealing with. So that you're correct. From the future side of things, that's where we're aiming that Cayman's proposition. Europe is such a big market for us. It's very important that we are there getting our MiCA license, and players like India and the Middle East are such big regions, and there's so many people and there's so much so much need for crypto and crypto assets and trusted players that I think VALR would do well in those jurisdictions just on the basis of just pure trust and pure serving humanity is what we like to say.
Great. Nick, thank you so much. Good luck in your global expansion.
Thank you,
And
Michael.
we would love to hear more about that. A very elaborate talk and very interesting.
Awesome.
So again, thank you, and would love to hear about VALR's successes.
Perfect. Thank you for having me, Michael. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by Cyvers, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. Cyvers harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit cyvers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.